as Ben mentioned, I am currently a PhD student. I'm in my third year of about a 6-year program. So what I'm presenting today is kind of preliminary research. It's not the end product of a book-length dissertation, but I hope it's interesting and we can have a discussion about it. Before I went into academia, I worked in San Francisco in both media and technology companies. I was a documentary film producer at Current TV, which some of you may remember, Al Gore's not so fabled documentary startup, which was great. And then I also worked at Ticketfly, which is now part of Pandora. All right, since I'm talking today about the way that software depicts urban neighborhoods, I'll be using quite a few maps and images. In the interest of time, I'll be moving a bit quickly, but the talk is being recorded, and I'm happy to share links and copies afterwards as well, and take questions. Okay, so I wanted to get a sense of what familiarity people have with geography as an object of study. Has anybody here, you can just raise your hand if you've taken a college level course in geography. We got 1, 2, 3. All right. And that's not uncommon. And so one of the things I want to start with is just what does it mean to be a geographer? In the United States, geography is often thought of as a subject for school children. It's simple memorization of things like the longest rivers or state capitals. And while trivia is fun and interesting, it's not really enough to sustain an academic discipline. So what do geographers do? I'll be quick with this. I won't dwell on the definition, but suffice it to say, writing the earth is geography, or in a broader sense, studying the world. This seems, pretty diverse. There's quite a lot. You could say, don't anthropologists study the world, sociologists, political scientists, humanities scholars? What makes something particularly geographic? And to that, we're going to turn to one of the bad boys of the German Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant. A lot of fans in the room. Excellent. And, he said very clearly that history is about the course of events, and geography is about phenomena that occur simultaneously across space. So that's one very simple way to think about what geography does. So historians ask when and why, and geographers ask where and why, and seek to understand the spatial logic behind environmental systems and human activity. We might call this pattern and process, and of course they're inextricably linked. So geographers might explore a spatial pattern like the street grid of New York City, and you might learn a lot by freezing the grid in place and looking at it as a network, or figuring out what effect it has had on real estate values or urban politics. But without knowing the historical processes by which these patterns were created, the story is incomplete. So we've come a long way from the tools that we use since Vermeer's painting of the geographer from the mid-17th century. Sometimes I wish this is what my day-to-day looked like, just kind of staring out the window and pondering. But in reality, it's a lot more like this. So today, many geographers, social and physical scientists, government officials, and private sector spatial analysts use GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, to model and understand the world. Who's familiar with or has used a GIS at some point? Okay, so that's interesting. We saw very few people had taken a class in the discipline of geography, but many more people have used these kinds of software systems that represent spatial patterns and processes. So a rudimentary definition is any kind of informational system that integrates, stores, edits, analyzes, and shares geographic information. Think of it as a backend powering any digital map, keeping track of locations and attributes, some of which will later be visualized for users in maybe some kind of front end or finished map product. We're not going to talk about this sea of logos and terms today, but just keep in mind that all of the images we discuss rely on that GIS backend powering their systems. Okay, the final question of 3. Who's used one of these services? Okay, everybody in the room, I imagine. If you haven't, I'd love to talk to you afterwards. You'd be a great research subject. But this is what happens when you combine powerful geospatial software and ubiquitous GPS signals, declassified from the original military strength in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And as you may recognize, many of these services are based here in the Bay Area, which makes Berkeley a great place to study them from. So the people who develop these kinds of services commit to a series of decisions about how to portray the world. And the three most widely used kind of levels of GIS or geospatial information systems are points, lines, and polygons. So you could say this office might be represented by a point. It's all along a street network. If you wanted to get technical about the building and the square footage, you might have actually a polygon, so a shape that's enclosed. And what's interesting about the urban neighborhood is that it's a revealing level of abstraction because it can take such varied forms in software. So in today's talk, I argue that the standard depiction of neighborhoods in software reflects an instrumentalist understanding of urban space that was already discredited in mid-20th century social science. Oh, did we lose it? So first I'll review the history of the dominant approach to neighborhood in location-based services and other geospatial software. Then I'll discuss how they're commonly portrayed. We'll look about the spatial politics of digital neighborhoods. And that's where this talk goes, from kind of the technical decisions behind some of these software packages to effects on the ground and kind of struggles around things like gentrification, displacement, things that, again, may be familiar to some of you in this room living here in the Bay Area. And I'll finally look at some alternative approaches, or ways that we might reconceptualize what an urban neighborhood is and how we might understand it in software. Okay. So I want to start with an idea of what is a neighborhood? So for such a common sense concept, or a neighborhood is really hard to define with any consistency. So I'm just building off this paper by Barry Smith and David Mark, and they argue that even a tangible object like a mountain is itself an abstraction. You know, we don't have mountains as these kind of objects out in the world that exist. We have molecules and elevation fields from which people make decisions about what to call a mountain, what to call a hill, what not to call anything. So how could something as socially constructed as a neighborhood be any clearer if we don't even know for sure what a mountain is? And there are different ways that people have tried to solidify or fix these definitions. So a few American cities do have official neighborhood designations. So in Atlanta, they have something called neighborhood planning units. And those were created in the 70s by the city's first African-American mayor, Maynard Jackson, specifically to give underrepresented populations a voice. So he wanted to devolve power to the neighborhood level. But more commonly, municipalities are divided up into political units that may span multiple neighborhoods as understood by residents. And San Francisco is a great example of this. So here's an official Department of Elections map. You can see the supervisor districts span a number of neighborhoods, partly out of necessity because you need to ensure they're equal population, and neighborhoods aren't. And of course, even the neighborhood names here are quite subject to debate. You know, we see Potrero Hill, but no Dog Patch, for example, or the boundaries between them might be changing over time. So in this talk, I'm going to be drawing on a paper by a sociologist named David Madden. And he referred to the gentrification of downtown Brooklyn at the turn of the 21st century. And he called urban neighborhoods, like in this case Dumbo, he referred to them as a spatial project. So the named urban neighborhood is not just this innocent container, but it's actually a representation of specific interest groups who are advocating for specific goals. So in this case, real estate developers who wanted to rebrand formerly disinvested areas, urban politicians trying to attract tourists, businesses, and tax revenue, and affluent homeowners and renters aiming to reshape their surroundings. So Dumbo is an interesting example because it was basically created by one family, the Walentis family, who bought most of this area between the Manhattan and Brooklyn bridges in the late 70s for about $12 million. And they spent the next decade or so lobbying the city of New York furiously to allow them to redevelop this as a mixed-use live-work area, which Rudy Giuliani finally kind of agree to that in the mid-1990s. So the Walentis family then rented out art studios at below market rates as a kind of loss leader to attract wealthier non-creatives to residential units nearby. So this whole neighborhood was itself kind of the expression of this kind of spatial project. One, if we're talking about New York real estate, there's always a little bit of a creep factor. In this case, David Walentis, the son, used to make all of his young female tenants interview with him personally, and that's actually how he met his wife. So it's not just Trump, apparently. Okay, so Madden refers to this idea of abstract governable space, that neighborhoods are these kind of patchwork quilt. He calls this the Westphalian neighborhood imaginary, like the checkerboard of European states after the 30 Years' War. So these are clearly delineated, they're non-overlapping. You can't be in more than one neighborhood at a time, and therefore there's a struggle over how to define those neighborhoods and who gets to define them. So where does this idea come from? I see three main strands: the nation state, especially post the French Enlightenment, social science itself. We social scientists like to give things names and definitions, and sometimes they stick. And the real estate profession. So perhaps unsurprisingly, systematically delineated urban neighborhoods are a legacy of the environment, of the Enlightenment. In Paris, the numbered arrondissement system, are people familiar with this? In Paris, it's like a snail shell. You go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they have neighborhoods that have a number, in addition to some neighborhoods kind of having names. So these were adopted in 1795, the same year that the revolutionary government formally adopted the meter, so the metric system, and they were expanded by Baron Haussmann, who also produced the first accurate cadastral map of Paris in 1853, so the first map of property ownership in the city. Ironically, though, according to Marxist geographer David Harvey, loyalties to these new kind of state-sanctioned spatial units were crucial in the Paris Commune of 1871. So they started out as a government project, but then were kind of the key to local solidarity. So these things often have unintended consequences. Okay, the second main strand would be sociology, urban sociology, and specifically the Chicago School. So in the 1920s, University of Chicago sociologists named and mapped 77 community areas in Chicago, and they were trying to find neighborhoods and gather data on them systematically. They didn't want to use existing parishes or city council districts. They wanted something that was more organic, and yet paradoxically, these definitions haven't changed over time. And the reason for that is you want to be able to compare data year over year. So again, the struggle for fixing something and understanding it doesn't keep up with the reality. So before long, urban planners like Clarence Perry were urging cities to engineer their own neighborhood units, as he called them. So they assumed that the self-contained urban neighborhood could be artificially reproduced in new development. And the reasoning here is interesting. Perry thought that the introduction of the automobile menace had ripped cities apart, and he advocated rebuilding this kind of cellular structure where each neighborhood would have a school, churches, a shopping area. And a lot of this kind of parallels some debates in the 90s around new urbanism. So these ideas kind of come in and out of fashion over time. But that said, to a large extent, Perry was mourning a village-like vision of city life that never quite existed. It's kind of an ideal. And then starting in the early 20th century, people picked up on these ideas and started laying out suburbs along these rail and road networks. This is a map in Berkeley's collection showing the Oakland Hills and one particular developer laying out neighborhoods, many of them are still there. And they were benefiting from federal housing incentives, racially restrictive covenants. This, in the small print, it says something about only the most desirable residents will be allowed in these neighborhoods, so kind of code words and not so code words. Some of them are very clear about what they mean by that. And then, while some developers were creating new neighborhoods, other realtors, not necessarily construction new construction, but realtors in the post-war area were trying to rediscover neighborhoods in downtrodden areas. What's interesting about rediscovery is that a lot of these neighborhoods may have never existed to begin with. So today, Brooklyn is known for its urban authenticity, but until the 1940s, according to this historian, Suleiman Osman, the borough consisted of large, nameless swaths of tenements and townhouses between port and industrial areas. So the early efforts to locate Brooklyn's authentic neighborhoods were carried out by two groups of outsiders with different motives: community organizers and real estate agents. And here's a map from about 1980. What's funny is some of these, like Burham Hill is a really interesting example where there's actually not a hill there even, and there was one Dutch landowner from hundreds of years prior named Burham, but he only owned like a small chunk of it. So it was really kind of, basically it's just made up. It was kind of a nice sounding name. Who wouldn't want to live on Burham Hill? Okay. So that was a little bit of history. Now we're going to step much more closely into the present and talk about what software developers use today to represent these neighborhoods. So the geographer Helen Kuklelis points to the fundamental discrepancy between the boundary-poor empirical world and the boundary-happy technology that we use to understand and manipulate it. I'm sure many technically minded people in the room are familiar with how much computers like neat boundaries and consistency. So many developers encode neighborhoods as these polygons that enclose homogeneous areas, which is a kind of software version of this Westphalian spatial imaginary. You can think about it as a quilt of neighborhoods that touch, don't overlap, and cover the whole city. So here's a map of San Francisco showing just that. This is using neighborhood boundaries from the real estate website Zillow. Zillow is part of a conglomerate that represents over 60% of the online real estate market. Has anyone ever used Zillow? Been on Zillow? Yeah, a lot of people. They have about 70 million monthly users. So this image isn't just a map, but it's a representation of an underlying data structure that allows prospective home buyers to filter searches based on different neighborhoods. And what's interesting here is, with the exception of Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, which is managed by the National Park Service, and a few outlying docks, you can see every parcel of land is assigned to one and only one neighborhood. So this is kind of the logical extreme. Of course, not every one of these services reaches the same conclusions or chooses to depict neighborhoods in just this way. So when I was trying to understand and bring order to this messy group of services, I came up with the following set of questions. So are the boundaries mapped polygons? It's the most simple one. Do they not overlap? Do they fill all of the space within a city? Is there a hierarchy grouping them into larger regions? And are they named? So just using these questions, I set out to kind of put together a representation of where these different services fall. And I won't go into detail of this. Again, I could share it afterwards if you're curious. But I think what's important here is to realize that real estate and tourist websites dominate the more legible side of the spectrum. So the closer you get to this ideal of every place being in one and only one neighborhood, the more likely it is to be a real estate or a tourist website. And this makes a lot of sense. So the increased importance of subdividing and branding space for those who intend to profit from its sale or lease, or even people spending a short amount of time passing through a space. And I think of Airbnb as a really interesting example here. There was a blog post by several engineers recently where they made this assertion that cities themselves, not individual rental apartments, are Airbnb's real product. And the quote, which I think is a lovely quote, is, "If Apple has the iPad and the iPhone, we have New York and Paris." So like any commodity, the city can be broken down into individual products and targeted at various subgroups of consumers through Airbnb's focus on branding and selling urban neighborhoods. And they've rolled out this neighborhoods product to, I think, about 20 to 30 cities worldwide. You can click through and get photographs, descriptions. You've got these little tags of there are bars, this is popular. So clearly this is their product line. They're trying to kind of brand space in a coherent way. Okay, so we've seen that there's a certain way of representing urban space common to a variety of these services. So what? How does this intersect with real world issues like gentrification, income inequality, and policing? So I see a few different ways in which it does. So first, contested neighborhood boundaries, the related contested neighborhood names. These kind of bleed into each other. And third is what I'm calling the social effects of neighborhood scale. So the way that the size and kind of arrangement of these neighborhoods affect how these products actually work and the kinds of things you can do as a user of these software. So location-based services like Yelp assign neighborhood names to businesses based on their address. And these consequences of these neighborhood names can be keenly felt by local business owners. In 2011, the restaurant Nojo complained about being listed in Civic Center / Tenderloin instead of the swankier Hayes Valley, like some of the restaurants down the block. They were worried about losing customers by being in a less desirable neighborhood. So actually in this case, there was an article by Chronicle food critic Michael Bauer who then appealed to Yelp to change the designation, which they did. So this is a fairly trivial example, but something similar happens with the maps used by realtors themselves. So this is the official SF Realtors Association map. Every few years, there are kind of these revisions that come out. And so in 2012, Noe Valley and Glen Park both annexed portions of less attractive adjacent neighborhoods, immediately increasing home values for property owners. At least that's the hope. And then new neighborhoods like Yerba Buena and Candlestick Point, you can see down here by Candlestick Park, they gobbled up huge chunks of the historically stigmatized South of Market and Bayview neighborhoods, which leads me to my next section. So these kind of arguments about what's in and what's out have actual financial consequences for the people involved. Okay, sometimes the named neighborhoods don't just expand and contract, but completely subdivide or replace each other. So the urban geographer Neil Smith wrote a famous book about the Lower East Side in New York called The New Urban Frontier. And since he wrote that book, you can see his definition of the Lower East Side starts at East 14th Street, which Google now tells us fairly definitively is something called the East Village. The East Village didn't really exist until the 1990s or late 80s. And it was another part of one of these projects where you have Greenwich Village, now the West Village, and you have this part of the Lower East Side adjacent to it. And so the realtors thought, okay, well, this isn't that far away. Development seems to be moving in this direction. So by rebranding, we get away from the Lower East Side and the tenements. We have something that's associated with Greenwich Village. And Google's kind of following along with that trend. So this is something that's maybe already happened. There are some of these in progress right now, including right here in the Bay Area. So close to the Berkeley campus, there's a struggle over a group of realtors' effort to rebrand several historically African-American neighborhoods in North Oakland, Berkeley, and Emeryville as Nobe, so North Oakland, Berkeley, Emeryville, welcoming the diaspora of hipster homebuyers priced out of San Francisco. Has anyone heard of Nobe?
I live there. Well, it's the Golden Gate District.
Yeah.
I don't call it Nobe at all because it's really contested like this.
Right, but you've heard the name. Yeah, it's an ongoing.
Oh yeah, there's YouTube videos about this. You can look it up.
Yeah. If I had more time, I would show the video, but that's a good tip. And so this obviously has not been. This has been contested. If you read the poster here, it says "Greetings from Nobe, New Oakland Bourgeois Elite." So they came up with their own acronym. And then some local activists point to this enclave of gentrification as the flip side of increasing police surveillance of minority Oaklanders. So this is the 2011 map of the North Oakland Gang Injunction Zone, so an area where there are kind of enhanced police powers to kind of curtail the activity of people thought to be in gangs. And this is overlaid with Realtor Lynette Edwards' definition of NOBI. So here you can really see the efforts of securing the territory for a particular group of people, maybe at the expense of someone else. And so some politicians have started to respond to these efforts to rebrand areas of their districts. So in 2011, Brooklyn Assemblyman Hakeem Jeffries introduced a bill to prohibit realtors from inventing new neighborhood names. You might call this a kind of semiotic rent control. I'm not sure what this would have looked like in practice, but unsurprisingly, in a city historically dominated by the real estate industry, the bill did not pass. And he was particularly worried about things like Prospect Heights and Crown Heights being the pro-Crow, and then South Bronx being the so-bro. The examples are everywhere and been parodied in places like South Park, Portlandia. I'm sure you're familiar with other examples. So the final category, I want to get deeper into the actual operation of a specific set of geospatial software, in this case, the popular neighborhood social network, Nextdoor. And again, how many people use Nextdoor? About half, a third. And there's nothing wrong with that. You're not bad people. I'm on it too. I have a kid, and so whenever we're trying to get rid of, old strollers or something, it has its uses. But we should be aware of kind of what's going on behind the scenes. So Nextdoor is a combination community bulletin board and neighborhood watch in a lot of ways. And so the way it works is membership is restricted to residents in a particular physical location. And one of the ways they prove that is by sending you a code in the mail that you can use to tie your address to this piece of software. So posts are by default only visible in your own neighborhood and a few adjacent ones. But advertisers and government representatives like the police have the ability to send universal messages or target by specific groups. So it is ad supported. It started out without any revenue model, but they've started to introduce ads, which are funny because they're oftentimes for things like home security systems and there's a lot of product integration. So Nextdoor is most concerned with boundaries that create active communities. They don't particularly care, to the best of my knowledge, whether their neighborhood definitions reflect what people would actually call the place they live. So this is a map showing the Oakland Hills, so just northeast of Lake Merritt. And you can see that there are smaller units in high-income neighborhoods in the hills, and then larger ones as you get further downtown. To the point where there's neighborhoods called Upper Santa Re, so that's about 4 blocks. But it was the home of early adopters. It's very heavily used there. And so it kind of broke off as its own little unit. So it seceded, you might say. So one study of Nextdoor, there hasn't been a lot of work done on this because it's so brand new, but one study referred to this as kind of an island effect. So when you get put into one of these neighborhoods, you primarily see what's happening to your closest neighbors, and you don't really have a sense for the broader city, or your kind of participation in kind of politics at a different scale. If you zoom in close enough on your own neighborhood, you get this, I think, pretty revealing view. So this shows you all of the houses in your neighborhood. It shows you the ones that are and are not on Nextdoor. And to me, at least, the red looks like this kind of open wound that is begging to be healed. So, Nextdoor won't really be happy until we can kind of fill everything in, turn it up to 11, and really fill space perfectly. Also, I've moved since taking this screenshot. This is not my home address, but you don't need to tell them that. Here are some even starker examples of fragmentation in San Francisco neighborhoods on Nextdoor. So you can see Post International and 601 Van Ness. Each of these, has anyone seen these buildings before? Yeah, they're individual condo buildings in a fairly, I don't need to tell you all, a mixed income and somewhat marginal part of San Francisco. And what's really interesting to me about neighborhoods like this is that they speak to a much longer history of redevelopment, of racialized exclusion, and of kind of urban politics. So this I overlaid the location of those two neighborhoods onto a map from the planning study for the redevelopment of the Western Addition in the Fillmore district. And as you can see, their existence is kind of predicated on the urban renewal of that part of San Francisco. So these areas were bulldozed and replaced with kind of newer buildings, with the Japantown Mall, with a number of public housing projects. And so these areas were kind of freed up to construct these high-value condominiums. And now, if you're on Nextdoor, you can kind of stay cocooned in that little bubble. Okay, so this is sort of the flip side of urban renewal and gentrification is state-sanctioned segregation in housing policy and mortgage lending. So there's some evidence that suggests that sites like Nextdoor could be reinforcing these sorts of class and racial boundaries, drawing lines between us and them, and amplifying the voices of neighbors who want to use the site to profile people they feel don't belong. And there's an interesting study, it's not of Nextdoor or other technical services, but there was a sociologist named Jacqueline Huang who interviewed people in Philadelphia. And she revealed a kind of racial dimension to the different spatial imaginaries that these different residents had. So when she talked to white residents of a particular area, they would refer to places like Newbold or University Hill as where they live. And they would come up with these very specific boundaries and specific names. And they would exclude areas that didn't seem to match, their own social status. And minority residents, on the other hand, define their neighborhood as South Philly, so a much larger area with a single name, pretty consistent boundaries, and kind of a long history. So that, again, you see this sort of like chiseling away at previous understandings of urban space. Again, to some people in this room, this may be familiar, but we've seen kind of press reports, and some of you may have seen personally, the use of these kind of neighborhood social networks to profile presumed others. This is a story in the East Bay Express. I highly recommend it if you're curious about this issue. And it actually got some national press. Some of these comments themselves from Nextdoor were put in the magazine Harper's. So I'll pause for a second so you can read these. So I didn't know there was a week when people come to take your Christmas presents, but apparently that's a thing. But this last line of the second quote, he did not look nor sound like any neighbor I know. So this idea of who is a neighbor, and what's especially interesting is like, this is Oakland we're talking about. This isn't like some small, mostly majority white town in Iowa. Like this is a diverse city. So the idea of, is your neighbor the person a block away, 10 blocks away, a mile away? These actually have consequences to how you might act. So Nextdoor has responded to this. I think it's important to see how. So a local activist group called Neighbors for Racial Justice persuaded the city council members in Oakland to block participation on Nextdoor by the Oakland Police Department and other city employees. So they realized that a large kind of use case of Nextdoor was that communication with city government. And so they put pressure on city government to try to clamp down on some of these profiling incidents. So in response, Nextdoor put its faith in this kind of technical fix that used user experience design to kind of either wipe out racism or at least the overt expression of it. So you can see here, when you start posting about neighborhood safety, it gives you this little educational pop-up saying, what were they doing? Identifying someone solely by race is not, racial profiling is prohibited. So very clear there. And then, I think even more revealingly, if you actually start to post about someone's race and then just submit the report, they'll stop you. So they've actually put in a kind of a feature where it'll make you add other identifying features. So you can't just say, there's a black man who's doing something suspicious. You have to say, there's a black man with a SF Giants hat and a blue sweater. and the idea that that's going to at least provide more useful information or kind of tamp down some of these incidents. So that's one effect, but you could say even if people aren't overtly racially profiling, there might be other issues about the use of these kind of platforms. And one is the idea of the squeaky wheel getting the grease. So when you have a technology platform like Nextdoor allowing increased communication with the police department, the people who use that platform the most are going to be represented the most. So their voice is kind of increased. And the mayor of Seattle, Ed Murray, replied to kind of some of the concerns of some residents there. He said that the places getting the most social media complaints, in this case Nextdoor, are not the places that have significant crime problems. So when you enable this kind of acceleration of communication via this platform Nextdoor, what you get is more reporting of car theft, bicycle theft, sort of property crime, and that might be diverting police resources away from parts of the city that might have other issues to deal with. And then finally, this is only a theory so far, but it seems to me that filtering these interactions into smaller spatial units could be actually having an effect on what people think of as their neighborhood and interacting with their existing prejudice in actually a fairly kind of predictable way. Has anyone heard of the Schelling model of urban segregation? It's kind of it's a classic paper from 1971 by the economist Thomas Schelling. And he was trying to understand, given a population that has a slight racial prejudice, that wants to live around people that are mostly like them, you can run a simulation model and see what happens over time. If you say, if X of my neighbors aren't like me, move. And over time, what you can see is even with a very slight preference to live among your own kind, in this case, over time, these very segregated outcomes can be the result. So this is an early paper in what's called complexity science, in this case showing how very simple rules can result in these kind of complex and maybe unanticipated end results. If you're curious about this, there's online multimedia artist V. Hart and game developer Nikki Case in 2014 made an online interactive called Parable of Polygons. And in this, you actually get the chance to kind of initialize these conditions and watch over time. You can't really see the red line, but the measure of segregation going up over time, and you can kind of change how prejudiced the people are. So basically, this is one way. It's very simplified, as all models are, but it's a way of understanding how these little actions might add up into kind of a broader social pattern, spatial pattern. So I'm interested in the way that changing some of the assumptions in the model might affect the outcomes. So one way you can do that is change the radius. So you can say, instead of looking at everyone within 2 cells of me, let's look at 5 cells. Let's look at 10 cells. And what that does is you think of it as a kind of buffer. So if I only look at my nearest neighbors, I'm going to have to, and I want 60-40 or whatever the model is, I might have to move all the time. There's more noise, there's not really a kind of buffer. But if I increase the radius, so in this case from 1.5 to 5 to 11, what you see is over time less segregation in a stable outcome. And again, this is very reductive, very simplistic way of looking at it, but it seems to me to kind of square up with what we saw with Jacqueline Huang in Philadelphia and what we see with some of these Nextdoor neighborhoods. If I think my neighborhood is literally 10 houses and one family moves in who I, for whatever reason, don't want to live near, my expectation is then kind of totally changed versus if I think of myself as living in Oakland or San Francisco or these kind of broader units. Okay, so again, this is not the only way we can think of neighborhoods. They don't have to be these kind of territorial units where we're all kind of fighting over space. There are other ways. So, and there are many different software products that use these different ways of understanding space. So you have things like overlapping polygons. Yelp, Airbnb, and Google Maps use those. Numbered polygons, fuzzy ones, attributes, points, lines, and you could just not use them at all. A lot of these navigation apps, they don't really care where the mission district is, because usually people are going from one place to another place, one specific location. So I'll just conclude by briefly sketching out a few of these and see what they might look like. So Yelp, Airbnb, Google Maps, they allow multiple named neighborhoods to overlap. You can see this visualization of neighborhoods in Dublin. You can clearly see those overlapping. And this makes sense, because if you think about user behavior on a site like Airbnb, they're trying to produce the most efficient kind of search results. And I might say something like Central Dublin, or I might say a specific neighborhood. So for the Airbnb developers, having these multiple indexes for each point in space is helping their users find something. And unlike a realtor, these don't need to be exclusive. I don't need to protect the value of one property by saying, oh, this parcel is in it and this one is not. So they can afford to be a little bit more flexible. There's a project at Carnegie Mellon called Livelihoods that uses locations of tweets and Foursquare check-ins to kind of inductively create neighborhoods. And what's interesting is they don't even try to give them a name. They're all just livelihood number 43. So this is interesting because it might show you lived experience, at least among people who use Twitter and Foursquare a lot. So again, there's kind of a built-in bias there. But it has this kind of inductive rationality, not a territorial one in the same way. But of course, what happens in a place like Paris where we have numbered neighborhoods? Well, over time, the numbers themselves become signifiers and they hold meaning. So if you talk to a Parisian and you say, are you from the 16th? The 16th is a number to me, but to a Parisian, it might be associated with chalalas, which I think are snobby people of some sort. If there are any Parisians in the room, you can help me out with this chart. So the number can just become another name. Another way is to think that neighborhoods do exist as objects, but that the borders are kind of fuzzy and probabilistic understanding. So this is following Kevin Lynch's method in The Image of the City, which he produced in 1960. Here's an image from Boston showing, okay, well, the Back Bay is definitely here, and it might also be here, but that could also overlap a little bit with Beacon Hill. So it's a little bit more kind of fuzzy and experiential. And people have tried to operationalize this with kind of user-contributed content. So this is Bostonography, which kind of redid that project. And it seems to offer some help if you're trying to say, well, where is the South End? It's not quite exact, but we have a rough sense of where it is. Craigslist is great because Craigslist has this quirky kind of cyber-libertarian spirit. Again, you live in San Francisco, I'm sure you know a little bit about Craigslist. If you're looking for listings like an apartment on Craigslist, has anyone ever had this? You're like, oh, I really want to live in the Mission. Wait a second, this thing says it's in the Mission. It's actually in the Outer Sunset. Well, that's by design. I mean, Craigslist is all they're saying is here's a list of neighborhoods, and when you post a listing, you can choose whatever, like there's no tether between the location and the name. So unlike Nextdoor, which says one-to-one, like you're in this area, you're in this neighborhood. Craigslist just lets it go free. And in some ways, people just try to rip you off by saying a place isn't where you think it might be. But you also get this kind of fascinating picture where you can see the struggle to define, like, is this the Castro? Is it the Mission? Is it Potrero Hill? And this might also be another way of arriving at more like an everyday understanding. Some services like Openstreetmap, which is the open source kind of competitor to Google Maps, as a contributor to Openstreetmap, you can just call a neighborhood a point, which, in theory, you could reconstruct polygons based on where all the points are, but in practice, it gives you this much more kind of permissive, like, yeah, that point, that's definitely the Mission District. And then if you're near it, you're near it. We're not trying to say it's this kind of discrete step from one to another. It can be a lot more fuzzy. And then, of course, even before today's digital mapping platforms, there were people who saw this idea of the discrete self-contained neighborhood as a convenient fiction. So this is Ruth Glass, who is best known today as the coiner of the term gentrification. And already in 1945, she was saying, look, self-contained urban neighborhoods don't exist. The boundaries differ. And she did these kind of projects in Bethnal Green neighborhood in London. Well, is it a neighborhood? We'll see. So she mapped where different people did most of their shopping. So you can see, very similar to the Craigslist example, there are these kind of porous overlapping boundaries. And you might guess that, well, a person's location in space matters, but it also might matter where they go to church, where were they brought up, where's the grocery store that caters to their foods, or maybe they're from a different part of the world and they travel across the neighborhood and go to the West Indian grocery store. So you get a little bit more nuanced kind of interpretation of space. And then another feminist geographer, Doreen Massey, I want to end with this idea that maybe we can have a sense of place that's progressive, that's not defensive and self-inclusive, but outward-looking. So maybe this effort to fix a right way of ordering urban space misses the point. In an era where borders and walls are increasingly creeping back into political discourse and everyday life, maybe it'd be worthwhile to re-examine some of the borderings we make in software and assess what does this do for us and what does this close off. All right, thank you very much. Take questions. Any questions? Yes?
What connection is there between neighborhoods and city lines or lack of?
The boundaries between cities?
Well, or like the relationship between these neighborhoods comprise the city, or maybe it's one's on the border of two, or, you know.
That's a good question, and I think the East Bay makes that pretty clear. So that neighborhood, Nopa, is actually split between 3 cities. So it's Berkeley, North Oakland, and Emeryville. So I think in some cases, it's pretty clear that they aggregate up to these bigger units, but it's often not that cut and dry. It can be, both of them are kind of arbitrary. Like political units are arbitrary, but then again, so are these sort of bottom-up social units. Other questions? Yes?
What's your next studying of research?
Well, one of the things I'm working on is trying to do a little bit of a prehistory of some of these services. So if you think of something like Yelp, which is extremely popular and used all the time, this didn't really come out of a vacuum. So you have things like the Zagat Restaurant Survey in New York, which was this crowdsourced review guide to the city. And then it kind of, now it has a digital function and is kind of incorporated into some of these scores. But I'm looking at the kinds of, what do you learn about a city by seeing the way that some of these services chop it up. So it's this is very, very preliminary, but over time you see more and more neighborhoods, and they're kind of more finely dissected, sort of like what we saw with Nextdoor, to the point where like there's neighborhoods that are like 2 or 3 blocks. So I want to see how we get from the mid-1980s to kind of where we are today. Yeah.
Is there much work on predictive models for what's going to happen with different neighborhoods and given changes in laws or whatever?
Yeah, there's a ton of work on that. A lot of it's proprietary. So there are different people who would want to know that. So there's people like the community activists side of things and the realtors. So there's a project called Am I Rent Controlled in New York City that helps local residents and activists find out kind of what might the next frontier of gentrification be. And it uses some of these tools like leases coming up, large zoning changes, and it tries to say like, oh, the next hot spot is going to be, East New York, a neighborhood that until now hasn't had a lot of investment. But based on these factors, we can go there. What I will say though is there's a lot more money to be made doing that prediction on the other side. And I think that's something I'm cognizant of in my own work, that if I were ever to figure out a model for predicting gentrification, that is a double-edged sword. Like, somebody might want to use that to decide where to buy an apartment building. So yes, there is, but it's not always public.
In your study, what do you know of cities that manage gentrification in a way that you agree with and that you think is good?
Wow. As an academic, we don't think anything's good. No, I'm kidding. That's a really good question. I think Berlin is doing a better job than many other places in trying to understand some of these effects and maybe slow things down a little bit. But it's hard. I think in a place like Germany, where you have a more kind of committed social democratic state that's been intervening in property markets in a lot of ways, it's a lot easier to do than here in the Bay Area, where despite our liberal beliefs on many axes, like it's still a pretty free market kind of place. And so a lot of the solutions to things like this aren't solutions that many policymakers like. And yeah, I'm sure you've seen it in all the ballot initiatives that come up in San Francisco. Yeah, in the back.
As a software developer, are there some things that we should keep in mind when sort of implementing maps and things in applications to not increase segregation or whatever? Like, are there some things to watch out for?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. I think one of the things is just to keep in mind, I would say like this is one kind of categorization, but I think in general, like that quote, a boundary happy system meets a boundary poor world. And wherever you set that boundary, it might be a kind of provisional, it works, let's ship it, but then you might have created some system that is, and the example that comes to mind is something like a red line map, where you can say the government was like, oh, 60% of people default on their loans here, so we're just not going to guarantee loans here. And in some ways, that's a heuristic that will let you lose less money on mortgages. But when you do that without kind of considering maybe the process that led to that pattern, you end up kind of deepening the cycle of inequity. So maybe going back to the beginning, it's like, don't just think of space as this empty container full of objects. If you think of it as socially produced and historically produced, you might find that, oh, if I really make this kind of shortcut, it might kind of feed in on itself. It's like terribly abstract, but hopefully some of this is, and even some of the things about scale. Where are users allowed to go? Where do they have access to information? Where is their mobility constrained or kind of enhanced? Or things like, I think sometimes about the availability of Uber and Lyft as ride-sharing services. I live in the East Bay. It's great. Like, I can go to San Francisco Club, not that I do that because I'm a kid, but I could, and I could get home for 20 bucks. Amazing. But if you think about the way that people talk about, well, gentrification is good because it leads to trickle-down prosperity. That might have been more so the case when gentrifiers lived next to the existing residents. But what you see more and more in Oakland is that you can have this like Michelin-starred restaurant in a pretty crappy neighborhood, and nothing's really, there's no trickle down. And I think part of that might be related to the mobility, where if I can get in, pay for a $200 meal, and get out, I don't really care like if the building next door, didn't meet its code, or whether there's rent control, or whether the kids are going to school. And that sounds really cynical, but I think you have this ability to kind of parachute in and parachute out. And if we think about the technology that facilitates it, we might come up with ways to mitigate that. But, I'd love to continue the conversation. I think we're close to time. Are there any last questions?
This is maybe a really hard question, but given that you said you're sort of next research is looking at this other stuff, do you see a way toward what you ended with, of the sort of more outward-looking view? Do you see a way to facilitate that?
I don't know that there's a perfect answer to that. there's an interesting article I read recently about the New York Times writer Jenna Wortham was writing about being upset at traditional travel guides because they were intended for kind of a straight white middle class imagined consumer. And she was advocating using Instagram filters as a way to have this paradoxically less filtered view of the world. So she went to, I forget where else. She was on some beach and she wanted to figure out, oh, well, where do people who look like me and act like me, or where do I want to hang out? And she was just looking at Instagram photos in different areas as a way of skipping that kind of mediation. So I think that's interesting. I think people who are experimenting with, I'm forgetting the name, but someone in the East Bay started a service that's like, instead of a meal delivery, so instead of just like sending food from a restaurant to your house, it's people in their neighborhood cooking big meals, and then you go get it and take it home and talk to them. Yes, yeah, totally. So maybe there are things that we can do that use technology to actually cultivate community instead of substitute for it. But again, Godspeed. I don't build these things. I just critique the world. Anyway, thank you very much. Really appreciate the time.